first thing console, Vreth noticed about the human equipment bay was the smell. Not a bad smell, just a strange one, something between burnt metal and sealed rubber with a faint trace of something chemical underneath. The Sorathi did not have a word for it. He made a note to ask later. The bay was on the lower deck of Helix 9, far from the polished corridors of the upper station. Down here, everything was practical. Metal shelving ran in long rows from wall to wall. Yellow lines painted on the floor marked pathways between stacks of crates, coiled cables, and sealed containers of various sizes. A few loose tools hung on hooks near the far wall. A half-empty mug sat on a folding surface near a pressure valve assembly. Ray Dahlin was crouched next to the valve, running a calibration tool along its housing. He did not hear them come in over the hum of the ventilation system. He only looked up when one of Vreth's aides cleared his throat. Ray stood. He was not particularly tall, not particularly broad. He had grease on one forearm and a calm expression that suggested he had been interrupted many times before and had long since stopped finding it worth a reaction. He looked at Vreth, then at the two aides behind him, then back at Vreth. "Inspection," Ray said. "Routine compliance review," Vreth said. "Standard protocol for all crew quarters and supply sections this cycle." "Right." Ray wiped his hands on a cloth hanging from his belt. "Go ahead, I'll be here." He crouched back down and returned to the valve. Vreth stood for a moment, mildly unsettled by the complete lack of ceremony. Among the Sorathi, an inspection by a consul warranted at minimum a formal acknowledgement and a standing posture until dismissed. He made another note, filed it away, and nodded to his aides. They spread out through the bay with their scanners, moving row by row. Vreth followed at a measured pace, glancing at labels, checking storage conditions. Everything on the human side of the station was like this, functional, borderline chaotic to the Sorathi eye, but never actually wrong. Humans had a way of organizing things that only made sense once you understood the logic, and the logic was always, what is fastest to grab? He was halfway down the third row when one of his aides stopped. The scanner in her hand had made a sound, a sharp double tone, the alert frequency. Vreth crossed the row in 6 steps. He looked at the scanner readout. The display showed a molecular tag he recognized, not from routine supply catalogs, but from a hazardous materials classification document he had read years ago during a briefing on industrial accident response. He looked at the shelf. 4 sealed gray containers stacked 2 and 2. Standard human labeling, printed in block letters. No warning marks. No hazard bands. They sat between a coil of heavy cable and a box of steel fasteners as if they were the most ordinary things on the shelf. "Dahlin," Vreth called. Ray looked up from across the bay. He did not stand immediately. He finished tightening something first, then got to his feet and walked over without hurry. Vreth pointed at the containers. "What is in those?" Ray glanced at the label. Thermite compound, premixed, sealed for storage. He looked back at Vreth. "Why?" Vreth did not answer immediately. He read the scanner again. The classification was not a misread. The material registered at the lower boundary of Class 4 on the Galactic Hazardous Materials Scale. Class 4 required licensed containment units, atmospheric isolation, and a registered disposal protocol on any certified station. These containers had no containment unit. They had no atmospheric isolation. They were sitting on an open shelf next to a coil of cable. "How much of this do you have?" Vreth asked. Ray thought for a second. "On this row, 4 containers. I think there are 6 more in the back section." He paused. "Is there a problem?" Vreth looked at his aide. The aide was already flagging the row on her slate. He looked back at Ray. "I am ordering a full material analysis of this section," Vreth said. "Please do not move or access any containers until the review is complete." Ray looked at the shelf. He looked at Vreth. His expression did not change much, but something in it shifted, a small confusion. the kind that comes not from guilt but from genuinely not understanding why something ordinary is being treated as unusual. "It is just thermite," Ray said. "Yes," Vreth said, "I know what it is." He turned and walked toward the bay exit to call for the analysis team. Behind him, he could hear Ray watching them go. The human did not say anything else. He just stood there in his practical, grease-stained calm, next to a shelf of Class 4 hazardous material he had apparently stored the same way someone else might store spare bolts. Vreth did not look back. He had a report to file, and he needed a few minutes to decide how to begin it. The analysis lab on the middeck was not built for arguments. It was built for data. Long white panels lined the walls. A holographic display table ran down the center of the room, currently showing 3 rotating molecular diagrams in pale blue light. The air was filtered to a clinical neutral. Nothing in the room had an opinion. Dr. Selim Adra had one, but he kept it to himself. He stood on one side of the display table with his hands in his jacket pockets, watching 2 alien science aides run compound identification sequences on the flagged materials from the equipment bay. Consul Vreth stood near the wall, not sitting, arms folded, reading something on his data slate. The aides had not spoken to Selim directly yet. They were working through the analysis in order, which was fine with him. He was patient. The first compound resolved on the display. Full molecular structure, source classification, known applications. One of the aides looked up. "Can you confirm this is a naturally occurring Earth derivative?" "Yes," Selim said. "Iron oxide and aluminum powder, both sourced from Earth. The refinement process is basic industrial chemistry, about 200 years old as a standard technique." The aide made a note. "And your crew maintains a regular supply of this aboard the station?" "Yes, standard operational stock." The second compound resolved. The aide's stylus slowed. Vreth looked up from his slate. The second material was a dense metal alloy with a particular crystalline structure that made it exceptionally stable under pressure, but catastrophically unstable when exposed to a specific frequency of kinetic impact. The Galactic Materials Database classified it under restricted industrial use. It required a licensed handling permit on 47 member worlds. "This one," the aide said carefully, "where does this come from?" Selim looked at the diagram. "Depleted uranium variant, Earth-derived, refined from uranium ore, standard process." He paused. "We use it for ballistic applications." The aide stopped writing. Vreth set his slate down on the nearest surface. He walked to the table slowly, like someone approaching something they were not sure they wanted to look at directly. He studied the molecular diagram for a moment. "Ballistic applications," he repeated. "Projectile weapons," Selim said, "specifically armor-piercing rounds, high-density, stable flight path capable of penetrating reinforced materials on impact." He said it the same way he might describe the properties of a good insulating material. Plain, accurate, no drama. The room was quiet for a moment, except for the soft hum of the display table. The third compound began resolving. Then the fourth. The aides were working faster now, as if speed might somehow change what they were finding. It did not. Each new compound that came up on the display had the same pattern, naturally occurring Earth material, refined through processes humans had developed centuries ago, classified somewhere between restricted and prohibited on the galactic hazardous materials scale. By the time the 7th compound resolved, one of the aides had stopped taking notes entirely and was just staring at the display. The door opened. Lindau came through it carrying a toolkit over one shoulder, already moving at the pace of someone with 3 things to finish before lunch. She slowed slightly when she registered the room, the display table, the alien aides, Vreth's expression, and glanced at the compounds rotating in the blue light. She recognized one of them immediately. "Oh, that one's interesting," she said, tilting her head toward the 4th compound on the display. We used a refined version of that in incendiary munitions. Old design, maybe 300 years ago. Burn temperature high enough to go through vehicle armor. She shifted the toolkit on her shoulder. Messy. Effective, though. She was already at the far door. "See you, Dr. Adra." The door closed behind her. Nobody in the room moved for a full 3 seconds. Selim looked at the display. He looked at Vreth. The console was staring at the door Lynn had just walked out of with an expression that was very controlled and very still, the way a person looks when they are processing something that does not fit into any category they already have. One of the aides made a very small sound. Not a word, just a sound. Vreth turned back to the table. He looked at the line of compounds. He looked at Selim. "How many of these?" he said, and then he stopped. He started again. "How many of these materials does your crew consider standard?" Selim considered the question seriously. "Most of them," he said. Vreth nodded once, slowly. "I would like to schedule a longer session tomorrow," he said. "I have more questions." "Of course," Selim said. Vreth picked up his slate and left. The aides followed him. Selim stood alone in the analysis lab for a moment, looking at the 7 compounds still rotating on the display table in their calm blue light, each one a piece of something humans had spent centuries learning to use and had long since stopped thinking twice about. He picked up his notes and went to find some tea. Ambassador Pira arrived on the station without announcement. She was not the type to announce herself. She was the type to already be in the room by the time you thought to wonder if she was coming. She represented the Galactic Science Council, which meant she technically outranked everyone on Helix 9 when she chose to exercise it, and she almost never chose to exercise it. She preferred to watch. She had been watching for approximately 11 hours before she asked to be included in Vreth's follow-up session. The analysis lab had been rearranged overnight. The compound display was cleared. The holographic table now showed a single long horizontal line, a timeline, stretching from several thousand years in the past to the present. Human history, pulled from the station's shared reference archive. Ray stood to the left of the table. Selim stood beside him. Vreth stood across from them. Pira sat in the only chair in the room, slightly behind Vreth, and said nothing. Ray had not been told she was coming. He glanced at her once when she walked in, nodded once the way he nodded at most things, and returned his attention to the table. "You wanted the material history," Ray said to Vreth, "so here it is." He touched a point near the far left of the timeline. A marker appeared. "Bronze," he said. "Roughly 5,000 years ago, humans figured out how to mix copper and tin and get something harder than either, started using it for tools, then for weapons, swords, spear tips, armor." He moved his finger along the line. "Then iron, harder, more available, better edge. A few centuries later, steel, better than iron, stronger, more flexible, could be shaped more precisely." Vreth was watching the timeline. "These are metals found naturally on Earth." "Yes." "And you weaponized them." "We weaponized everything," Ray said, without any particular pride or shame, just a fact. "That is what the timeline shows." Selim took over for the next section. He moved the marker forward along the line and pulled up a compound diagram alongside the timeline entry. "Gunpowder," he said, "a mixture of sulfur, charcoal, and potassium nitrate, all naturally occurring. The mixture produces a rapid exothermic reaction when ignited. Humans were using it in warfare by approximately the 9th century. He paused. "That translates to roughly 1100 years ago." One of Vreth's aides had been taking notes. The aide stopped. Vreth did not notice. He was looking at the date marker. 1100 years ago, Vreth said. "Yes. Before your species had aircraft." "Long before," Selim said. "Before you had electricity." "Yes. You had explosive projectile weapons before you had electricity." "We had a lot of things before we had electricity," Ray said. Piera, from her chair, made a very quiet sound that might have been a breath or might have been something else. No one looked at her. Selim continued. He moved through the timeline steadily, shaped explosive charges, high-density metal projectiles, incendiary compounds. Each entry had a date, a compound diagram, and a brief notation on its primary use in human conflict. Vreth asked questions at each one. His questions started careful and became more careful as the session went on, the way a person gets careful when they are trying very hard not to react. Then they reached the final section of the timeline. Ray let Selim handle it. Selim pulled up the nuclear material entry with the same neutral expression he had carried through the entire session. He explained fission. He explained the yield of early devices. He explained that humans had used nuclear weapons against other humans in active conflict, and that within decades of that event, they had built enough of them to destroy the planet multiple times over. He said all of this in a tone of voice better suited to explaining the weather. Vreth had not moved in several minutes. The aide behind him had given up on notes entirely and was simply standing. It was Commander Aurak who broke the silence. Nobody had noticed him arrive. He was in the doorway, arms folded, leaning against the frame in the easy posture of someone who had been listening long enough to have an opinion. "You had all of this," Aurak said, looking at the timeline, "thousands of years before you left your planet." "Yes," Ray said. Aurak was quiet for a moment. Then he asked the question. He did not say it loudly or dramatically. He said it the way a person asks something they have been working up to for a while. "Is that why no civilization ever tried to take Earth before first contact?" The room went completely still. Ray looked at the floor, not out of guilt, more like he was giving the question the weight it deserved. Selim looked at Piera. Piera was looking at the timeline. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes moved slowly across the dates, one after another, the long record of a species that had spent several thousand years learning to destroy things before it ever looked up at the sky and thought to go somewhere. Nobody answered Aurak's question. Nobody needed to. Ray reached over and closed the timeline display. The room went dim for a moment before the ambient lighting adjusted. "I think that covers the material history," he said. Everyone left the room separately, in their own time, in their own silence. The council chamber on the upper deck was built for decisions. Curved walls, an oval table, dim warm lighting that was designed to feel neutral, but always ended up feeling heavy. The alien script running along the border of the walls was a standard Galactic Council inscription, something about knowledge and shared progress. Vreth had never found it particularly comforting. He sat at the head of the table. Piera sat to his left. 3 council aides filled the remaining seats. The door was closed. No humans had been invited and no humans were present. That was the plan, at least. Vreth opened the session by laying out the situation plainly. The inspection had flagged 23 distinct materials aboard the human crew section of Helix 9. Of those, 19 were classified as restricted or prohibited under Galactic Hazardous Materials Code. All 19 were being stored openly, without containment, without permits, without any indication that the human crew considered this unusual. "I want to be precise about what I am not saying," Vreth said. "I am not saying the humans are a threat. I am saying they have the capacity for threat at a scale we did not account for, stored in a location we share, maintained by a crew that does not appear to understand why anyone would be concerned." One of the aides, a younger official named Dorak, leaned forward. "But they have not done anything. In 80 years of contact, no human has used any of this against another species." "Correct," Vreth said. "So the question of intent matters," Dorak said. "Capacity without intent is not a classification event." "I disagree," said the aide across from him. "Capacity at this level changes the calculation regardless of intent. If intent changes, we have no warning interval. There is no time between decision and consequence. Pyrrha said nothing. She was looking at the table surface. The timeline they showed us, Vreth said, is the part I cannot resolve. These materials were not recently acquired. Humans have been producing, refining, and using them for thousands of years. They used them extensively against each other. The conflict record is significant. He paused. And yet here they are, still existing, still functional, apparently having decided at some point to stop using them on each other quite so much. That does not mean they will not use them on someone else, the concerned aide said. It also does not mean they will, Doric said. The debate continued in that circle for some time. Each argument was reasonable. Each counter was also reasonable. The problem was that neither side had evidence that could close the question, because the question was not really about evidence. It was about how you felt when you stood in a room with a species that had spent millennia building things capable of planetary destruction and had somehow survived long enough to shake hands with you. Vreth was about to call a procedural pause when the door opened. No one had knocked. Commander Orek walked in. He looked at the table, at the people around it, and at Vreth. He did not apologize. He pulled out the nearest empty chair and stood behind it, hands on the back, which was somehow more imposing than sitting down would have been. I heard enough from the corridor, Orek said. I will be brief. Vreth could have removed him. He did not. You are trying to decide if humans are dangerous, Orek said. That is the wrong question. They are obviously dangerous. That timeline is not a secret. Anyone can read it. He looked at Doric. The question you should be asking is whether dangerous means threatening, and for that I will tell you what I know. He had everyone's attention. I have worked security on this station for 4 years. In that time, I have worked alongside 6 human crew members. None of them have ever talked about their weapons history the way a warrior talks about weapons. They talk about it the way a builder talks about old tools. Something that was used, something that worked, something that is sitting in the back of the storage room because you never throw out something that still functions. He paused. That is not the posture of a species looking for a fight. Doric started to speak. Orek continued. The most dangerous thing about the humans on this station is not what they have in their storage bay. It is that they do not think of themselves as dangerous. A species that knows it is dangerous plans around it. Humans carry Class 4 materials the same way I carry a blade, not because they are planning to use it, but because not having it would feel wrong. That is not aggression. That is habit. He let go of the chair back. I came in without permission and I will leave without being asked, he said. But I wanted you to have that before you filed anything. He left. The door closed. The room was quiet for a long time. Pyrrha was still looking at the table, but her expression had shifted. Something in it had settled. Vreth looked at the aides. Neither of them reached for their notes. We will adjourn for tonight, Vreth said, and we will think. Nobody argued. Ray found the observation corridor by accident on his second week aboard Helix 9, and had been coming back to it ever since. It was not an official common area. It was a transition corridor between 2 functional sections of the upper level, with a long row of transparent panels running the full length of one wall. Whoever designed the station had not intended it as a viewing space. The panels were structural, not decorative, but the view was there regardless. The gray-green planet below, the slow drift of distant station traffic, the hard dark of open space beyond. Late in the station cycle, the corridor lighting shifted to a low amber. Most of the crew was on rest rotation by then. Ray liked it for exactly that reason. He ate his ration pack there when he did not feel like sitting in the mess. He thought there when he had something to think about. He was working through the last of the ration pack when he heard footsteps. He expected Lynn, who sometimes did late maintenance runs through this level. He did not expect Consul Vreth. The consul moved along the corridor with his usual measured precision, but there was something different about him tonight. He was not carrying his data slate. His hands were at his sides. He looked, for the first time since Ray had met him, like someone who had put the job down for a few minutes. Vreth stopped a short distance away and looked out at the planet. "You do not mind," he said. It was not quite a question. "No," Ray said. They stood there for a moment. Ray finished the last of his ration pack and folded the wrapper into his jacket pocket. Vreth spoke without turning his head. "I have been trying to find the correct framework for your species for 3 days. Every time I think I have found one, something in your history does not fit." Ray did not say anything. "You have had access to materials capable of significant destruction for thousands of years," Vreth continued. "When your species first made contact with ours, you had those materials. You had the delivery systems. You had the history of using them." He paused. "Why did you not?" Ray was quiet for a moment. He looked out at the planet. "We were scared," he said. Vreth turned slightly. "Of us. Of the whole thing. We had spent a long time fighting each other and we knew what we were capable of. When contact came, most people's first instinct was not to attack. It was to hold still and see what happened." Ray shifted his weight. "Having a weapon and wanting to use it are not the same thing. We had learned that the expensive way." "The timeline," Vreth said. "The timeline," Ray agreed. Vreth was quiet. The planet below turned slowly in the light of the distant star. "In our records of your early contact period," Vreth said, "there are accounts of human officials who were formally advised that they were outmatched technologically, that your spacecraft were slower, your communications weaker, your numbers smaller among the galactic community." He stopped. "And yet you were not afraid." "We were afraid," Ray said. "We were just used to it." That landed somewhere. Ray could see it in the small shift of Vreth's posture. "There is something I have not been able to ask in the formal sessions," Vreth said. He chose the next words carefully. "When your species looks at that timeline, all of those materials, all of those centuries of conflict, what do you feel?" Ray thought about it seriously. He did not rush the answer. "Tired," he said, "mostly tired, and something like relief that we are still here to feel tired about it." He looked out at the stars. "The hard part was never building the things. That part came naturally, which is its own problem. The hard part was building enough of an understanding of ourselves to know when not to." He paused. "We are still working on that part." Vreth said nothing for a long while. The station made its quiet background sounds. Ventilation, distant machinery, the faint vibration of the hull adjusting to temperature differential. All of it familiar to Ray by now, all of it still slightly foreign to the console standing beside him. "You said you were used to being afraid," Vreth said finally. "Humans have been afraid of something for as long as we have records," Ray said. "Weather, animals, each other, the dark. We built most of our history out of trying to be less afraid of the next thing. After a while you get comfortable with the fear. You stop waiting for it to go away and you just start moving while it is there." Vreth looked at the planet. "That is a very strange way to exist," he said. "Probably," Ray said. "It is the only way we know." They stood there a little longer, not talking, just two people at a window looking at the same sky from different histories. When Vreth finally left, he did not say good night. He just walked. Ray watched him go, then turned back to the view. The planet was the same as it had always been. It did not care about any of this. Ray found that comforting. Pyrrha finished her official report at the 6th hour of the station's morning cycle, then sat for a while in the empty analysis lab with the lights at half level and the display table dark. The official report said what it needed to say. Humanity's material stockpile aboard Helix 9 had been reviewed. A formal reclassification recommendation had been drafted. The language was precise and considered. The way all Galactic Science Council language was precise and considered. And it said, in measured institutional terms, that humanity represented a case requiring updated classification parameters. The report did not say what Pyrrha actually thought. She opened her personal notes file. She had kept personal notes throughout every assignment in her 40 years with the Council. They were not policy. They were not evidence. They were the things she noticed that did not fit into official categories. She read back through the last 3 days. The equipment bay, the analysis table, the history session with the timeline. The corridor conversation Vreth had described to her this morning, quietly, over the kind of brief breakfast that meant he had not slept well. She thought about the timeline for a long time. Not the materials themselves, not the yield values or the compound diagrams or the classification levels. Those were facts, and facts were not the thing sitting at the back of her mind refusing to be filed away neatly. The thing she kept returning to was the dates, the sheer distance between the first entries on that timeline and the last one. Thousands of years of building things that could end each other, and the species was still there, still argumentative, still sending engineers to fix pressure valves on joint research stations in neutral orbit. She wrote one line in her notes. They were never primitive, we just never looked closely enough. She closed the file. The official report was filed by midday. Vreth presented it to the full council representation via transmission, and Pyrrha sat in the background of the frame where she usually sat during these things, listening to the formal language do its best to contain something it was not quite built for. The recommendation was accepted. Humanity's galactic status would be reclassified, not as a threat, not as a protected species in the traditional sense of the phrase. The language the drafting committee had settled on, after considerable discussion, was reserved assessment pending extended contact review, which was institutional language for we are not sure what category fits and we would like more time to understand before we decide. It was, in Pyrrha's experience, the most honest thing the council had produced in about a decade. Vreth found his way to the observation corridor in the late afternoon. He did not plan to. He was walking the upper level to clear his head before the transmission debrief, and he ended up there the way a person ends up somewhere that has started to carry meaning without their permission. He stood at the transparent panels and looked at the planet below. A human cargo shuttle was moving through the near-station lane on a standard supply run. He could see its running lights, the slow, steady drift of it, nothing unusual. Standard traffic. He had seen 100 like it in the past week. He watched it and noticed, for the first time, that he did not know what was in it. Before 3 days ago, that would not have registered as anything at all. Cargo shuttles carried cargo. You checked the manifest if you needed to know, and you did not check it if you did not. That was the ordinary logic of a working station. But now he was looking at that shuttle and the not knowing had a different weight to it. Not fear exactly. Something more like the feeling of standing in a room and realizing the room is larger than you thought. The walls are further out than you assumed. The ceiling is higher. Ray Dolan was probably somewhere in the lower deck right now, calibrating something, drinking from that half-empty mug, carrying on with the practical business of existing in the way humans carried on with things. And in the storage bay behind him were 23 materials that Vreth's civilization had classified as dangerous, sitting on open shelves, completely unremarkable to the person who walked past them every day. A species that had survived itself. That was the phrase that had formed in Vreth's mind during the history session and had not left since. Every other civilization in the galactic record that had reached the level of destructive capacity humans had documented had either stabilized before using it at full scale or had not. The ones that had not were historical entries, quiet planets, archaeological sites. Humans were neither. They were here, filing manifests and eating ration packs, and standing at viewports late at night explaining that fear was something you got used to, and that the hard part was knowing when not to. The cargo shuttle drifted out of view. Vreth stayed at the window a little longer. He was not sure what he was waiting for. He was not sure there was anything to wait for. The work was done, the report was filed, and the station would continue its business tomorrow the same as it had today. He was simply standing here because somewhere in the last 3 days, the universe had become slightly larger than he had thought it was, and he had not finished adjusting to that yet. He was not sure he would,